David threw me into a Boston blizzard when I was 18. My pregnancy was just a stain on his immaculate social standing. 6 years later, the man who told everyone I was dead filed an emergency custody petition for a granddaughter he had never met. He did not want her. He had simply caught the scent of the $2.5 million trust fund her billionaire father just established. Have you ever been sold out by blood for a payout? Let me know where you are listening from and what time it is right now. The cold stayed forever. I survived on a razor's edge. I worked the graveyard shift at a diner near the harbor, where the wind off the Atlantic cut through my thin coat like broken glass. I was an accounting student once, but David made sure that door slammed shut. Instead, I learned to balance a ledger using crinkled $5 bills left as tips on $80 checks. My apartment in Dorchester had no reliable heating. It did have black mold. I spent my days scrubbing the bathroom walls with bleach, terrified of the wheezing sound Mia made when she slept. She was 5 years old, brilliant, and fighting asthma because I could not afford better air. Every hospital bill, every grocery receipt, every food stamp voucher went into a fireproof lockbox under my mattress. I kept them because numbers do not lie. Numbers are proof that you existed when the world tried to erase you. David lived in a multi-million-dollar brownstone in Beacon Hill. He had a private chef and a seat on the board of a local investment fund. He lived 20 minutes away, yet the distance between our lives was an uncrossable ocean. I did not ask for his help. I knew the price of his charity was total submission. So I worked double shifts, brewed cheap coffee, and taught Mia how to add using sugar packets. I built a fortress out of loose change and sheer will. It was miserable, but it was mine. I owned every inch of my poverty, which was better than renting a space in David's pristine, suffocating world. I did not realize my struggle was not just bad luck. I thought I was simply failing at adulthood. Every apartment application I submitted for a safer building was instantly rejected. The property managers looked at my background check with pity or disgust, telling me my debt-to-income ratio was catastrophic. I was utterly confused. I had no credit cards. I had never taken a personal loan. I bought my groceries in cash, but the rejections kept coming, forcing us to remain in that freezing, mold-infested studio. I accepted it as my punishment for getting pregnant at 18. I thought the universe was just balancing its own ledger, charging me interest on my perceived mistakes. I spent countless nights staring at the cracked ceiling, doing mental arithmetic, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. I analyzed my meager income, tracking every single penny that went to formula, diapers, and inhalers. The math never added up to the financial ruin the landlords claimed I was in. I felt like a failure. I believed the lie that I was inherently irresponsible. The sabotage was human. The only lifeline I had to my old life was Caleb. He was my younger brother, studying to be an auditor, and he was terrified of David. Everyone in our family was terrified of David. He controlled the tuition payments, the car leases, the inheritance. Caleb would text me from burner applications, asking to meet at a playground on the far outskirts of the city. He would show up looking over his shoulder, handing me plastic grocery bags filled with secondhand winter coats and boots for Mia. He was 21, brilliant with spreadsheets, but entirely paralyzed by the financial leash around his neck. One freezing Tuesday afternoon, we sat on a peeling wooden bench while Mia chased pigeons across the frozen grass. Caleb handed me a thermal cup of coffee and stared at his shoes. He mumbled something about David's accounts. He said David was making incredibly strange transfers, paying off high-interest debts that did not match his public image as a financial guru. He mentioned a credit card statement he had accidentally seen sitting open on David's mahogany desk. I brushed it off entirely. I was too exhausted from a 14-hour diner shift to care about a wealthy man's secret spending habits. I told Caleb to keep his head down, to pass his exams, and to secure his accounting degree before David found a reason to cut him off, too. I did not want my brother to set himself on fire just to keep me warm. I sipped the cheap coffee and told him to forget the statement. I ignored the red flags because surviving took absolutely all my bandwidth. I could not afford to investigate a corporate mystery when I barely had enough cash to buy Mia's asthma inhaler. That willful ignorance was a massive miscalculation. I treated David's secrets as irrelevant background noise, assuming his greed operated in a completely different stratosphere than my daily struggle. I failed to see the invisible threads connecting his luxury to my suffering. I should have asked Caleb to copy that statement. I should have looked closely at the account numbers and the names. I should have questioned why a millionaire was shuffling high-interest credit card debt. But I was bone-tired, and I was shivering, and I just wanted to go home to my damp apartment and sleep. Mia ran over, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and wrapped her small arms around Caleb's legs. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that I rarely saw anymore, and handed her a small wooden train he had carved himself. He was a good uncle, trapped in a terrible family dynamic. He risked his entire future just to bring us coffee and coats. I promised myself that one day I would free him from David's grip. But for now, we had to play our roles. We hugged goodbye. The freezing rain was coming down in thick, gray sheets when he walked into the diner. It was a miserable Friday night in late November. The neon open sign outside was flickering, casting harsh red shadows across the sticky linoleum floors. I was meticulously wiping down table 7, calculating in my head whether I could skip my own dinner to buy Mia fresh fruit for the coming weekend. The little brass bell above the door chimed. I did not look up immediately, too focused on scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain. When I finally raised my eyes, my breath caught sharp in my throat. He was wearing a tailored wool coat that seemed to absorb the rain rather than repelling it. His posture was perfectly still, radiating a quiet, undeniable authority. It was Julian. 7 years ago, he was just a quiet foreign exchange student I met during freshman orientation at the university. We shared one reckless, lonely night before David found out and threw me out into the snow. I never even knew his last name. I only knew the shade of his eyes and the cadence of his voice. Now, he was standing in my rundown diner, looking at me like I was a ghost he had spent years trying to summon. He did not order food. He ordered black coffee and waited patiently in the corner booth until my shift ended at 2 in the morning. I sat across from him in a booth that smelled permanently of stale grease and bleach. He did not yell. He did not act betrayed or angry. He simply slid a sleek, heavyweight business card across the scratched table. It bore the crest of a massive Swiss banking empire. He told me he had spent 2 years and a small fortune hiring international private investigators to find the girl who vanished into thin air. He had searched every state registry, every local database, looking for a single trace of me. I looked at the card, tracing the embossed lettering, then looked up at his face. I did not hide the truth. I told him about Mia. I told him he had a daughter who adored vintage trains and struggled to breathe when the Boston weather turned damp. A man who commanded financial boardrooms across Europe put his face in his hands right there in the diner. His broad shoulders shook, but he made absolutely no sound. He maintained his dignity even in his absolute heartbreak. He did not demand to see her immediately. He did not claim ownership. He looked at me with profound respect and asked a single, steady question. How could he protect us? I realized in that moment that true power does not arrive with threats and ultimatums. It arrives with resources, patience, and a willingness to listen. Julian was offering me a shield, not a cage. I took a deep breath, letting go of the tension I had carried for 6 years. We started building walls. People always ask why I did not leave Boston, why I did not walk into a police station, a major charity, or a government office and demand proper shelter. They ask why I accepted a life of scrubbing toxic mold and dodging roaches when I was capable of so much more. It is remarkably easy to judge from the outside. When you are raised by a man like David, you are strictly taught that the world is a highly transactional, dangerous place. He raised me to believe that any form of help came with a suffocating, unbreakable contract. He controlled the thermostat, the grocery list, the very air we breathed in that Beacon Hill brownstone. If I asked for a new winter coat, I owed him unwavering obedience for months. If I made a minor mistake, he froze my bank accounts and humiliated me at the dinner table. That kind of psychological conditioning does not disappear just because you are thrown out into the snow. It wraps around your mind like an invisible, heavy chain. I was deeply terrified of owing anyone anything. I honestly believed that government assistance, large charities, or even a kind stranger would eventually demand a price my soul could not pay. So I consciously chose the misery I could control over the comfort that might enslave me. I accepted the freezing apartment because the landlord only wanted my rent money, not my dignity. I accepted the grueling diner shifts because the owner only wanted my physical labor, not my silence. It was learned helplessness masquerading as fierce independence. I was surviving, but I was living inside a psychological cage David had built in my mind long before he changed the locks on the front door. Standing at the kitchen sink, watching greasy soap water circle the rusted drain, I finally understood my own devastating paralysis. Julian's sudden appearance had terrified me at first because his immense wealth represented the ultimate, insurmountable debt. But Julian was not David. Julian did not want to buy me or control my decisions. He wanted to fund my armor. He wanted to give me the financial tools to fight back, asking for absolutely nothing but Mia's continued safety in return. He placed the agency entirely in my hands. I dried my hands on a ragged dish towel, staring at the bleak walls of my kitchen. I decided it was time to break the chain David had forged. I dialed the number Julian had written on the back of his business card. The line rang twice before his calm voice answered. I told him I was ready to talk about the future, about securing a life for our daughter that did not involve mold or fear. He simply said he would send a car. No lectures, no grandstanding, just quiet, effective action. I hung up and looked at Mia sleeping soundly on the folded futon, the invisible chains shattered. It was time to build. I was only 14 years old when my mother passed away. A fast, brutal cancer systematically destroyed her in a single, suffocating summer. She was the only source of genuine warmth inside that massive, drafty brownstone in Beacon Hill. David did not openly grieve her passing. He simply reorganized our lives. He treated his profound loss as a temporary dip in a corporate portfolio, requiring aggressive, immediate management to maintain his public standing. His public image became his absolute religion. He attended church twice a week, shook the correct hands at the country club, and ensured our family projected flawless stability. Inside those expensive walls, his psychological control was absolute and terrifyingly quiet. He never raised his voice, but he weaponized his substantial bank accounts to command total obedience. The first clear example of his tyranny was my 16th birthday. He orchestrated an extravagant, catered event entirely for his business associates. I was forced to wear a restrictive, incredibly uncomfortable dress, and he explicitly forbade me from inviting any of my actual high school friends. My personal social life offered zero return on his investment, so it was instantly liquidated. The second example involved Caleb's elementary school science fair. Caleb had spent 3 exhausting weeks building a wobbly, asymmetrical volcano out of paper mache. David inspected it, calculated that it looked embarrassing compared to the professionally purchased projects of his colleagues' children, and quietly threw it into the incinerator before we left for the school. He handed Caleb a pristine, store-bought model instead. Caleb cried silently in the back of the luxury sedan the entire ride. David calmly informed him that shedding tears was a pathetic sign of poor emotional management. The third defining moment involved the grand piano. I deeply loved playing, an emotional inheritance from my mother. However, I played entirely by ear, messily and with raw feeling. David immediately hired a strict classical instructor and demanded I prepare for a prestigious local recital to bolster his standing in the community. When I politely declined, stating I just wanted to play for my own peace of mind, he locked the piano cover and pocketed the brass key. He told me that applying passion without a strategic objective was simply a waste of expensive mahogany. My mother would have utterly despised the man he became. She would have held me, celebrating my messy piano playing and all my teenage flaws. I promised her silently at her granite headstone that I would never let David entirely erase my identity. But I was young. He held all the capital, and physical survival required strict compliance. I learned to mask my true thoughts, to nod respectfully at his country club dinners, and to swallow my objections completely. I became a master at executing the role of the perfect, quiet daughter. It was an exhausting performance. Caleb was barely 12 years old when I was permanently exiled. He was a deeply observant child who had already learned to meticulously navigate the treacherous waters of David's impossible expectations. When the front locks were changed on that freezing night, Caleb stood perfectly still at the top of the grand staircase. His small hands gripped the polished oak railing, his eyes wide with silent terror. David had strictly forbidden him from coming down to the foyer, explicitly threatening to revoke his private school tuition if he shed a single tear for his disgraced older sister. However, Caleb possessed a quiet, calculating rebellion that David completely underestimated. As the years passed, my little brother transformed into a master of corporate espionage inside his own home. He studied advanced accounting not because he loved analyzing ledgers, but because he understood that numbers were the only language David truly respected. Caleb learned to read complex financial statements the way other young men read comic books. He realized early on that control is always inextricably tied to capital. He remained my only covert ally in Boston. He utilized untraceable burner applications, carefully disguised his physical location, and funneled what little cash he could spare from his university tutoring jobs directly into my empty hands. He brought winter coats and boots for Mia, hiding them inside plain grocery bags. He never once asked for gratitude. He simply wanted us to survive the harsh winters. When Julian re-entered the picture, I knew I had an absolute obligation to protect Caleb from the impending fallout. I arranged a highly confidential meeting in a secure room at Vivian's downtown law office. Vivian was a formidable senior partner with sharp silver hair and a demeanor like reinforced steel. She did not waste billable hours on pleasantries. Julian was paying her substantial retainer, but she made it unequivocally clear from the first minute that she represented my interests alone. We sat around her massive glass conference table, and I outlined the reality of David's vindictive nature. I told her that if David discovered Caleb was assisting me, he would financially ruin the boy before he ever received his accounting degree. Julian listened with absolute focus, his expression calm and unreadable. He then turned to Vivian and formally authorized her to establish an independent, ironclad educational trust specifically for Caleb. It would fully fund his remaining university tuition and his future certification costs. It was completely untraceable, legally funneled through a blind corporate entity out of Switzerland. Caleb would instantly become financially bulletproof against David's threats. When I informed Caleb about the safety net later that evening, he sat in my small kitchen and openly wept. He had lived under David's financial guillotine for his entire conscious life. For the first time, he realized he could eventually walk out of that Beacon Hill brownstone without destroying his professional future. Julian had extended the shield to the only family member who mattered. The balance shifted heavily. I still occasionally dream about the mechanical click of the deadbolt. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in January. I had spent an entire week carefully planning how to inform David about the pregnancy. I waited until after dinner, precisely when he was pouring his single allotted glass of 18-year-old scotch. I stood nervously in his immaculate study, surrounded by expensive leather-bound books he purchased solely for display, and I delivered the truth. I was 18 years old. I was pregnant, and I fully intended to keep the baby. I expected him to explode. I had mentally braced myself for a screaming match, for shattered crystal, for the violent rage of an authoritarian patriarch losing his grip. He executed none of those reactions. He placed his glass meticulously on a dark leather coaster. He stared at me with an expression of profound, calculating disgust, treating me as if I were a defective piece of equipment ruining his carefully curated aesthetic. He calmly asked for the identity of the father. I informed him it was a foreign exchange student, a brief encounter, and that I currently had no method to contact him. David stood up, smoothed the creases of his tailored slacks, and delivered his final verdict. I had exactly 2 hours to gather my personal belongings and permanently vacate his property. He tasted the word disgrace, letting it slowly roll off his tongue with deliberate, refined cruelty. He added that my mother would be deeply ashamed, a tactical psychological strike designed specifically to inflict maximum emotional damage. I retreated upstairs, violently throwing my clothes into black plastic garbage bags because he explicitly forbade me from taking the matching luxury luggage set he had purchased for optics. I begged him, pleading for just 1 week to secure a safe apartment, or at least a single night to sleep before the Boston blizzard hit full force. He stood silently at the bottom of the grand staircase, checking his gold watch, completely unmoved by my absolute panic. When I dragged my bags onto the freezing concrete of the front porch, the wind instantly cutting through my thin sweater, I noticed a white commercial van idling in the circular driveway. It belonged to a local locksmith. David had dispatched the technician before he even summoned me to the study for our conversation. He had orchestrated my permanent exile before offering me a single second to explain my situation. I sat on the frozen steps, clutching my plastic bags, watching the technician replace the heavy brass lock on the front door. The metallic click echoed through the freezing air, legally sealing me out of my own history. David stood in the warm, brightly lit foyer, watching the process through the glass panes. He did not flinch. He simply pulled the heavy silk curtains shut, erasing my existence from his view. I slept in my car. The final, absolute confirmation of my isolation occurred inside a sterile county hospital room the following autumn. I went into active labor during a torrential downpour, forcing myself onto a crowded city bus because I could not spare the cash for a taxi. I tightly gripped the frayed handles of my cheap duffel bag, breathing steadily through the agonizing contractions while evening commuters actively avoided making eye contact with me. I checked into the maternity ward as a completely indigent patient. The intake nurse, a deeply exhausted woman with gentle eyes, handed me a standard clipboard filled with emergency contact forms. I stared blankly at the empty lines. Despite surviving months in the mold-infested studio, a foolish, desperate fragment of my childhood conditioning urged me to reach out one last time. I borrowed the hospital landline and dialed David's private corporate office number. I harbored a naive thought that the reality of a grandchild, a new biological life, might somehow pierce his armor of pride. His executive assistant answered promptly. I stated my legal name and explained clearly that I was in active labor, that I was entirely alone, and that I simply wanted him to possess that information. I was immediately placed on a brief, suffocating hold. When the assistant returned to the line, her professional voice was strained and perfectly flat. She relayed his exact, calculated message. David was currently facilitating a board meeting and did not wish to be disturbed by unwanted solicitors. I hung up the phone. The heavy plastic receiver clattered against the wall cradle. He knew exactly who was calling and what was happening. He simply chose his corporate board meeting over my physical survival. I picked up the intake form, clicked my blue pen, and left the emergency contact section completely blank. Under the specific section inquiring about family support history, I checked the small box clearly labeled Abandoned Youth. Mia was born at exactly 3 in the morning. The delivery room was freezing, illuminated by harsh, unrelenting fluorescent lights. I held her tiny, fragile body against my chest, feeling the frantic, perfect rhythm of her heartbeat against my skin. There were no celebratory balloons, no expensive flowers, no proud grandparents taking photographs to boast about in their social circles. There was only the steady electronic beep of the heart monitor and the quiet dedication of a night shift nurse. I looked down at my beautiful daughter and made a silent, unbreakable vow. I promised her that she would never, for as long as I possessed breath in my lungs, experience the devastating reality of being a problem someone purposefully chose to discard. I would become her entire world, her absolute shield against a society that favored the wealthy and discarded the vulnerable. He made his choice. David did not simply ignore my existence. He aggressively rewrote our family history to preserve his immaculate public reputation. A pregnant, homeless daughter was a catastrophic failure he could not afford to display at his corporate charity galas. Therefore, he fabricated a comprehensive narrative that transferred the shame entirely onto my shoulders. He systematically contacted every aunt, uncle, and country club associate to deliver his tragic, meticulously manufactured story. According to David's revised timeline, I had grown reckless, ungrateful, and inherently greedy. He informed the extended family that I had stolen thousands of dollars from his private study and run off to become an exotic dancer in Las Vegas. He painted himself as the heartbroken, long-suffering patriarch who had provided me with every conceivable advantage, only to be ruthlessly betrayed. It was a spectacular social performance, complete with somber sighs and calculated wiping of dry eyes over expensive champagne dinners. The most terrifying aspect was how easily and willingly they all believed him. Not a single relative attempted to verify his outrageous claims. Nobody hired an independent investigator. Nobody called the Boston Police Department to file a standard missing persons report. They accepted his neatly packaged lie without question, because acknowledging the truth that a respected local financial leader had abandoned his pregnant teenager to the freezing streets would have required them to confront their own complicity in his cruelty. It was far easier to mourn a fictionalized villain than to actively rescue a real victim. Over the course of 5 years, I slowly learned the vast depth of his defamation through Caleb's covert visits. Caleb would show me digital screenshots of David's social media posts, commemorating my tragic departure on my birthday, harvesting waves of sympathy likes from dozens of distant relatives. I existed in their collective reality merely as a cautionary tale discussed over Sunday brunches. I was furious initially. I drafted dozens of angry letters in my mind, planning to mail them to my aunts, exposing his lies, detailing the black mold in Dorchester and the brutal diner shifts. But I never mailed a single envelope. I realized with cold clarity that arguing with a narcissist's dedicated audience is a fundamentally losing battle. They had already purchased premium tickets to his show. Instead, I channeled that burning anger directly into my accounting textbooks. I allowed the false narrative to stand as a permanent, invisible barrier between my daughter and his toxic ecosystem. If they firmly believed I was a degenerate lost in Nevada, they would not come searching for Mia in Massachusetts. His elaborate lie became my highly effective, unintended camouflage. I embraced the death he had assigned me, using the profound silence to silently build my financial fortress. I stayed completely dead. I chose a quiet, remarkably unremarkable public park for our second meeting. I did not want Julian entering my apartment, primarily because I refused to let anyone from the outside world witness the black mold and the rusted radiator. We sat on a damp wooden bench under the sprawling branches of a massive oak tree. The Boston air was biting, carrying the distinct metallic scent of impending snow. Julian wore a dark, impeccably tailored overcoat. He sat perfectly still, maintaining a respectful physical distance between us, waiting for me to dictate the terms of our conversation. I did not offer him a dramatic narrative. I simply delivered the chronological facts of the past 6 years. I told him about the freezing night David changed the locks. I explained the reality of the county hospital, the absolute isolation of the delivery room, and the agonizing arithmetic of balancing minimum wage against the soaring cost of infant asthma medication. I watched his intelligent mind process the timeline. I watched him perform the devastating mental math, connecting his brief absence to my catastrophic exile. When I finally spoke Mia's name, Julian's composure completely fractured. He leaned forward, burying his face deep into his hands. His broad shoulders began to shake violently, but he did not make a single sound. A billionaire accustomed to commanding international boardrooms was quietly disintegrating on a public park bench in Dorchester. He wept for the daughter he had never met and for the unimaginable suffering I had endured entirely alone. He did not offer hollow apologies. He did not attempt to touch my hand to comfort himself. He simply absorbed the full, crushing weight of the truth. After several long minutes, he finally lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his expression had crystallized into absolute resolve. He did not demand immediate visitation rights. He did not threaten me with an army of corporate attorneys. He looked at me with a profound, unwavering respect and asked a single question. He asked what I needed him to do to ensure we were permanently safe. It was the question of a man who understood that trust is an architecture that must be meticulously built, not a commodity that can be purchased. I looked across the park, watching a group of children chasing a stray dog, and I realized something profound. For 6 years, I had been the sole, exhausting shield standing between my daughter and a deeply hostile world. I was incredibly tired of fighting the wind. I looked back at Julian, measuring the quiet integrity in his eyes, and I made a calculated decision to lower my defenses just a fraction of an inch. He offered a permanent shield. Julian did not simply offer financial assistance. He deployed a masterclass in wealth management. He introduced me to Vivian, a senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm. Her office featured thick, sound-absorbing carpets and panoramic views of the harbor. Vivian possessed the terrifyingly calm demeanor of a woman who systematically dismantled corporate empires before her morning coffee. Before we reviewed a single document, Vivian explicitly required Julian to confirm, out loud and on the record that she worked exclusively for me. If our interests ever diverged, she would legally eviscerate him. Julian agreed without a second of hesitation. We immediately began constructing the financial barricades. Vivian established an irrevocable generation-skipping trust for Mia. The initial principal was $2.5 million. It was legally structured with such draconian precision that absolutely no one could raid it. I could not touch the principal. Julian could not retract it. Julian's powerful Swiss family could not contest it. It was a flawless, impenetrable vault designed solely to guarantee Mia's future. Watching Vivian draft the clauses felt like watching a master architect pour solid concrete over my deepest anxieties. Julian also purchased a modest, heavily secured house in a quiet, safe suburb. He insisted the deed be placed entirely in my name, free and clear of any mortgages or hidden liens. He included specific legal language guaranteeing that the property remained mine regardless of whether he and I ever spoke again. He wanted me to possess absolute security, untethered from his presence. He fundamentally understood that financial control was the exact weapon David had used to destroy me, and he refused to replicate that dynamic. I sat at the massive mahogany conference table, methodically signing my name to dozens of pages. My hand cramped, but a profound, unfamiliar sensation began expanding in my chest. It was the distinct absence of terror. For the first time since I was 18 years old, I did not have to calculate whether buying fresh vegetables would result in a bounced utility payment. The crushing, invisible weight of sheer survival was slowly lifting off my shoulders, replaced by the sturdy reality of contractual protection. When we finally concluded the meeting, Julian walked me to the elevator bank. He did not ask for a celebratory dinner. He simply nodded, pressed the call button, and told me he would wait for my signal regarding Mia. He was giving me total operational control over the timeline. I stepped into the elevator, holding a sleek leather folder containing my absolute financial independence. The concrete finally settled. The transition into the new house was jarring in its utter silence. There were no clanking radiators, no drafty windows, and absolutely no trace of black mold. Mia had her own bedroom, painted a soft lavender, featuring a massive window that let in the morning sun. I spent the first 2 weeks constantly waking up in the middle of the night, automatically bracing for the familiar scent of mildew or the sound of roaches scurrying across the linoleum. My nervous system required significant time to recognize that the war for basic survival was officially over. I refused to abandon my career trajectory. Julian's money secured Mia's future, but I desperately needed to secure my own identity. I drastically reduced my hours at the diner and fully committed to my accounting studies. I sat at a proper dining table, bathed in warm light, and relentlessly attacked the material. 6 months later, I officially passed the final section of the Certified Public Accountant exam. I did not post the achievement on social media. I did not attempt to broadcast my success to the extended family who had gleefully attended my fabricated funeral. My victory was entirely private and intensely satisfying. While unpacking the last of our boxes, I found the battered fireproof lockbox I had dragged from the Dorchester studio. I sat on the hardwood floor and opened it. Inside lay the physical artifacts of my exile: faded hospital intake forms listing me as indigent, crumbled diner receipts highlighting $2 tips, warning notices from aggressive landlords. I slowly ran my fingers over the cheap, yellowed paper. A logical person might have thrown them into the fireplace, eager to obliterate the trauma. I carefully organized them into clear plastic sleeves instead. I recognized that these receipts were not symbols of my degradation. They were the absolute proof of my endurance. They were the undeniable accounting of exactly what it cost to keep my daughter alive when the world offered zero subsidies. I placed the meticulously organized binder back into the heavy iron box and engaged the combination lock. I knew, with the chilling intuition of a trauma survivor, that David would eventually discover my newly acquired stability. Men who thrive on control possess a supernatural ability to detect when their former victims have successfully escaped their gravitational pull. I slid the lockbox onto the highest shelf in my closet. I was no longer a terrified teenager bracing for a blizzard. I was a certified accountant holding a fortress of wealth, and I possessed the receipts to prove every sin he had ever committed. The storm was already gathering. David arrived at precisely 8 in the morning on a bright Sunday. The doorbell chimed, a melodic, pleasant sound, completely at odds with the predator standing on my porch. I checked the security camera monitor installed in the kitchen. My blood immediately turned to ice. He was wearing a tasteful cashmere sweater, holding a cheap, plastic-wrapped bouquet of grocery store carnations. His facial features were carefully arranged into a mask of grandfatherly sorrow and humble contrition. I did not panic. I simply stood in the hallway, observing him through the high-definition screen. I analyzed his micro-expressions. He had undoubtedly utilized his extensive network in the local financial sector to trace the massive influx of offshore capital connected to my name. The scent of $2.5 million had magically resurrected his paternal instincts. He pressed the doorbell a second time, adopting a practiced look of hopeful vulnerability. He was performing for the quiet, upscale neighborhood, playing the role of the estranged father seeking redemption. I walked to the front door, maintaining the heavy steel chain and the deadbolt. I engaged the intercom system, my voice projecting crisp and entirely devoid of emotion. I asked him to state his business. David's eyes widened slightly in surprise at the electronic response, but he quickly recovered. He began reciting a beautifully constructed monologue about grief, mistakes, and the passage of time. He claimed my mother's death had broken him, causing him to act irrationally. He whispered that family must always forgive, leaning heavily on the concept of bloodlines. I listened to his pristine performance while simultaneously running a mental audit of his claims. He was demanding immediate access to my life, offering nothing but cheap flowers and weaponized nostalgia. He conveniently omitted the locksmith. He omitted the absolute silence of the past 6 years. He was testing my perimeter, checking to see if the frightened 18-year-old girl was still hiding inside this new, expensive house. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a debate regarding his manufactured grief. I simply informed him, through the crackling speaker, that he was trespassing on private property and that any further attempts to contact me would result in an immediate police response. I watched his face contort on the monitor. The grandfatherly mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold, calculating rage underneath. He dropped the carnations onto the welcome mat and marched back to his luxury sedan. I kept the deadbolt locked, the illusion of safety shattered on a mundane Wednesday morning. I was sitting in my home office, drafting a complex tax strategy for a new client, when my mobile phone vibrated sharply against the desk. The caller ID displayed the name of Mia's private kindergarten. A massive surge of adrenaline flooded my system before I even answered the call. The school director's voice was remarkably professional, but I could detect the underlying tension. She informed me that an older gentleman, impeccably dressed and claiming to be Mia's grandfather, had arrived at the reception desk. He had requested a copy of the monthly activity schedule and inquired about the standard procedures for adding an authorized adult to the daily pickup roster. He had utilized a charming, authoritative tone, expecting the administrative staff to simply yield to his demands. The director assured me that they had refused to confirm Mia's enrollment and had politely asked him to leave the premises. My vision narrowed to a pinpoint. David had failed at the heavily fortified front door, so he immediately sought out the unlatched window. He was methodically probing the perimeter of my daughter's life, searching for a structural weakness. I thanked the director, grabbed my car keys, and drove the 3 miles to the school with white-knuckled precision. I did not speed, and I did not cry. I operated with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a soldier responding to an active breach. If you have ever had to build a legal fortress to protect your child from your own toxic family, drop A in the comments below. Let me know I am not the only one. I marched into the administrative office and requested the highest level of restriction forms available. I explicitly listed David's full legal name, his physical description, and the license plate number of his sedan on the permanent blackout roster. I legally mandated that the local police be dispatched immediately if he ever set foot on the campus again. I stood at the reception desk, my handwriting perfectly legible and completely steady, constructing a bureaucratic wall around my 5-year-old. Through the office window, I could see Mia playing in the sandbox, happily stacking plastic buckets, entirely oblivious to the predatory shadow that had just brushed past her world. David thought he was dealing with the desperate teenager he had easily discarded. He did not realize I had spent years analyzing his strategic maneuvers. I knew exactly how he operated, and I was preparing to shut down every single avenue of approach. The perimeter was officially breached. The temporary illusion of peace shattered on a mundane Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing a corporate tax ledger when Vivian summoned me to her downtown office. Her tone was strictly professional, devoid of any unnecessary panic, but the urgency was explicitly clear. When I arrived, a thick legal envelope rested precisely in the center of her glass conference table. David had officially filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship and co-trustee status over Mia. I sat in the leather chair, keeping my breathing perfectly regulated, and read the filing. The petition was a masterpiece of legal fiction. David's attorney had painted him as a deeply concerned, wealthy grandfather attempting to rescue his vulnerable grandchild from an unstable, financially reckless mother. The document claimed I lived in squalor by choice and harbored a volatile history of severe, unmanageable debt. He explicitly demanded control over Julian's $2.5 million trust fund to properly manage the minor's standard of living. I looked up at Vivian, completely bewildered. I informed her that I possessed zero debt. I had never opened a credit card, never taken a bank loan, and purchased everything with physical cash for 6 years. Vivian did not argue. She simply turned her dual monitors toward me and displayed a comprehensive credit report she had just pulled using my social security number. The screen illuminated a catastrophic financial history. There were 4 heavily maxed-out premium credit cards, 2 defaulted personal loans, and a staggering total debt exceeding $80,000. All of the accounts had been opened within a 3-month window exactly 6 years ago. It was the precise time frame immediately following the freezing night I was exiled from the Beacon Hill brownstone. My mind raced, piecing together the invisible puzzle that had kept me trapped in Dorchester. This was the phantom ledger that had destroyed my rental applications. This was the invisible barrier that kept Mia and me trapped in a mold-infested studio. David had not merely thrown me out into the winter storm, he had actively chained a massive financial anchor to my ankles to ensure I would absolutely sink. He utilized my clean Social Security number to secure temporary liquidity for his failing personal investments, effectively turning his own teenage daughter into a disposable corporate shield. He operated under the arrogant assumption that a homeless 18-year-old would never possess the resources or the knowledge to run a comprehensive credit check. He had banked heavily on my sustained ignorance and absolute silence. He engineered my poverty, And now he was weaponizing that exact same poverty in a court of law to steal my daughter's future. I did not cry. I did not scream. I stared at the digital numbers on Vivian's monitor, feeling a profound, terrifying calm wash over my entire nervous system. The ghost was him. I immediately contacted Caleb using our secure protocol. We met late that evening in Vivian's heavily guarded conference room. Caleb arrived carrying a thick, unmarked manila envelope. He looked exhausted, but his eyes burned with an intense, surgical focus. He placed the envelope onto the glass table, unclasped the string, and systematically laid out dozens of printed pages. He had spent the last 48 hours quietly auditing David's private home safe while the man slept. Caleb possessed the original credit applications. He had meticulously traced the digital IP addresses used to submit the online forms, proving unequivocally that the applications originated from the private router inside the Beacon Hill brownstone. Furthermore, Caleb had secured copies of the digital signature stamps. David had forged my name to authorize the continuous transfer of high-interest debt, utilizing the funds to silently cover devastating margin calls within his supposedly flawless investment portfolio. Vivian leaned over the documents, her silver hair catching the ambient light. She delivered a rapid, razor-sharp masterclass on the mechanics of financial justice. She explained that emotional trauma rarely secures a courtroom victory, but documented federal wire fraud is absolutely bulletproof. David's actions constituted severe identity theft, interstate wire fraud, and grand larceny. He had brazenly crossed a federal line. She detailed the rigorous process of tracking digital money. An irrevocable trust protects assets through strict statutory separation, she explained. But a forged signature leaves a permanent, highly visible scar on a financial institution's ledger. A bank's automated compliance system does not care about a father's tearful excuses. It only recognizes authorized versus unauthorized transactions. David believed his physical intimidation tactics would seamlessly translate to the financial sector. He was profoundly mistaken. Caleb sat back, finally exhaling a long, shuddering breath. For his entire life, he had been paralyzed by David's authoritarian control. But tonight, he had utilized his specific academic training to entirely dismantle the patriarch's empire. He handed me a USB drive containing the fully encrypted backup files, ensuring the evidence could never be accidentally destroyed or magically misplaced. I carefully slid the IP logs, the forged applications, and the routing numbers into a heavy black binder. I aligned the edges of the paper with methodical precision. We were no longer fighting a messy, emotional family dispute. We were preparing a comprehensive federal indictment, neatly packaged inside a civil custody hearing. David had unknowingly handed us the exact rope required to execute his public hanging. The weapon was loaded. The court required a mandatory mediation session before allowing David's emergency custody petition to proceed to a judicial hearing. It was a standard procedural hurdle designed to force hostile families to resolve their grievances privately. David's legal team immediately agreed to the mediation, confidently assuming they could easily bully an unrepresented, impoverished mother into a highly unfavorable settlement. They severely miscalculated the current variable. Julian insisted on attending the session. He wanted to deploy his high-powered corporate attorneys to utterly crush David by sheer volume. I sat Julian down in my quiet living room and firmly declined his offer. I explained that introducing Swiss banking lawyers would only validate David's narrative that I was a manipulative gold digger relying entirely on foreign wealth. I needed to execute this operation relying solely on my own documented reality. Julian listened, respected my explicit boundary, and agreed to stay home with Mia. How would you react if the person who actively destroyed your life sat crying, playing the ultimate victim in front of strangers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I spent the night prior to the mediation meticulously assembling my armor. I did not pack photographs or sentimental letters. I packed the heavy iron lockbox. I transferred the faded Dorchester eviction warnings, the minimal minimum wage diner pay stubs, and the crumpled pharmacy receipts for Mia's asthma medication into clear protective sleeves. I placed Caleb's comprehensive audit of the forged credit applications into the primary folder. On the morning of the mediation, I dressed with strict, calculated intention. I bypassed the soft, accommodating sweaters of my past and selected a severely tailored, steel gray suit. I tied my hair back tightly, eliminating any trace of softness or vulnerability. I looked in the hallway mirror and recognized the woman staring back. She was not a victim seeking an apology. She was a certified accountant preparing to balance a massively delinquent ledger. Vivian met me in the lobby of the Neutral Arbitration Center. She carried her sleek leather briefcase, radiating absolute competence. She reviewed the sequence of our strategy one final time. We would allow David to speak first. We would let him construct his elaborate fortress of lies, completely unhindered by our interruptions. We would wait until he felt entirely invincible. Only then would we begin the demolition. I was ready. The mediation occurred inside a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown high-rise. A licensed, remarkably neutral mediator named Helen sat at the head of the long table. A box of premium tissues was placed dead center, anticipating the inevitable emotional collapse common in family disputes. David arrived exactly 4 minutes early, dressed in his finest charcoal church suit. He projected the aura of a deeply wounded, benevolent elder statesman. His attorney, a polished man with perfectly styled silver hair, sat rigidly beside him. As Vivian and I entered the room, David immediately deployed his primary weapon. He looked directly at me and allowed his eyes to fill with tears. He produced a crisp white handkerchief and dabbed at his face, performing profound, agonizing heartbreak for the mediator. He did not say a word, allowing the calculated silence to broadcast his supposed suffering. The silver-haired attorney initiated the offensive. He aggressively launched into a rehearsed, highly dramatic narrative. He described a tragic scenario involving a rebellious teenage daughter who had squandered every privilege and fled into a life of squalor. He painted David as a desperate father who had spent years searching for his lost child, only to discover she was intentionally hiding his precious granddaughter out of sheer spite. The attorney then pivoted sharply to the financial allegations. He slammed a copy of the fabricated credit report onto the table. He vehemently argued that my $80,000 in delinquent debt proved I was fundamentally unfit to manage Julian's massive trust fund. He demanded that David be appointed as the primary financial conservator to protect the minor child from her mother's documented negligence. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my gray slacks. I did not interrupt the lawyer's aggressive monologue. I did not react to David's continuous, silent weeping. I monitored his micro-expressions. He was thoroughly enjoying the performance, entirely convinced that his expensive legal counsel was successfully intimidating me into submission. He believed the glass room belonged entirely to him. Vivian remained completely silent, calmly observing the performance over the rim of her reading glasses. We had explicitly planned for this exact theatrical display. David was confidently building his entire legal foundation on a ledger of lies. I simply monitored the clock on the wall, waiting for the lawyer to exhaust his aggressive vocabulary. I let him dig. When the silver-haired attorney finally concluded his aggressive monologue, a heavy, expectant silence filled the glass room. The mediator, Helen, turned to me with a sympathetic, slightly concerned expression, anticipating a tearful, desperate defense. I did not cry. I reached down, retrieved the black binder from my leather briefcase, and placed it squarely on the polished table. My voice emerged flat, steady, and entirely devoid of emotional fluctuation. I addressed the mediator directly, completely ignoring David. I stated that before we discussed the management of a $2.5 million trust, we needed to establish the factual baseline of the grandfather's historical devotion. I opened the binder and extracted a single, slightly yellowed sheet of paper. I slid it across the smooth surface toward David's attorney. It was the official county hospital intake form from the night Mia was born. I highlighted the specific demographic section. It clearly listed my status as fully indigent, with the emergency contact field entirely blank. I calmly informed the room that I had delivered the child utterly alone, while David was attending a corporate charity dinner 20 minutes away. Before the lawyer could formulate an objection, I slid a second document across the table. It was the commercial invoice from the Beacon Hill locksmith. The timestamp printed on the receipt indicated the technician had been dispatched precisely 2 hours before David had formally ordered me out of the house. I stated, with surgical precision, that a man who pre-books a locksmith to permanently lock his pregnant teenager in a blizzard does not genuinely care about family preservation. David's meticulously constructed tears instantly evaporated. The wounded elder statesman routine dissolved, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. He stared at the locksmith invoice as if it were a highly venomous snake. His attorney attempted to quickly intervene, aggressively stating that ancient family grievances held absolutely no bearing on current financial competency or the outstanding credit card debt. I looked directly at David for the very first time. I did not raise my voice above a conversational murmur. I informed him that we were finally going to discuss the $80,000 in delinquent debt. I touched the third tab of my heavy binder, feeling the solid weight of Caleb's comprehensive audit resting beneath my fingertips. The mask completely slipped. The profound silence in the glass conference room was heavy enough to fracture stone. David stared at the heavy black binder I had placed on the table, his carefully constructed facade of grandfatherly concern completely dissolving into raw, unguarded panic. Vivian adjusted her silver-rimmed reading glasses with methodical, terrifying precision. She did not raise her voice. She merely commanded the atmospheric pressure of the entire room. She opened the binder and extracted the comprehensive forensic audit Caleb had spent 48 sleepless hours compiling. She slid the first heavily annotated page across the polished mahogany surface toward David's impeccably dressed attorney. Vivian began to narrate the undeniable, documented reality of the $80,000 in delinquent credit card debt. She explained that financial institutions maintain permanent digital memories. She detailed how every online application leaves a definitive forensic footprint, specifically an Internet Protocol address that geographically pinpoints the exact location of the requesting computer. Vivian calmly informed the mediator that the IP address associated with every single fraudulent credit card application perfectly matched the private router installed inside David's Beacon Hill brownstone. She paused, allowing the geographical impossibility of his lie to fully materialize in the quiet room. I had been homeless, living in a freezing vehicle, entirely incapable of accessing his secure residential network. The silver-haired attorney shifted uncomfortably in his ergonomic chair, his professional confidence rapidly deteriorating as he scanned the technical data. Vivian did not stop there. She produced the digital signature certificates, explicitly showing how the security protocols had been bypassed using a secondary email address registered directly to David's personal investment firm. She articulated the absolute legal definition of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. She explained that utilizing a dependent's social security number to secure unauthorized corporate liquidity was not a minor family misunderstanding. It was a severe federal crime carrying mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. David's breathing became noticeably shallow and erratic. A fine layer of perspiration materialized on his forehead, completely ruining his curated, aristocratic aesthetic. He looked at the bottom of the audit report and noticed the official signature of the independent auditor who had verified the digital tracking. It was Caleb's full legal name. The realization that his deeply terrified, tightly controlled son had systematically dismantled his financial empire struck David like physical trauma. He stared at the signature, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute betrayal and profound disbelief. He had spent his entire life assuming that financial manipulation guaranteed permanent loyalty. I sat perfectly still, watching his internal architecture violently collapse. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply observed the mathematical certainty of his destruction. I had spent 6 grueling years scrubbing toxic mold and calculating the exact cost of infant asthma medication, because this man had decided my survival was an acceptable sacrifice for his corporate reputation. Now, the overwhelming weight of his own calculated greed was pulling him beneath the surface. Vivian closed the black binder with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed loudly against the glass walls. The trap had closed perfectly around his ankles. He was completely cornered. The silver-haired attorney spent exactly 3 minutes reviewing the IP logs, the forged signature certificates, and the routing numbers linking the fraudulent credit accounts to David's failing investment portfolio. A seasoned corporate litigator instantly recognizes the fatal distinction between a messy family dispute and documented federal felony fraud. The attorney carefully aligned the papers, placed them back onto the table, and systematically closed his expensive leather briefcase. He turned to the mediator and formally announced that he was immediately withdrawing as legal counsel for the petitioner, citing irreconcilable ethical conflicts. David physically recoiled as his lawyer stood up and walked out of the glass room without offering a single backward glance. The profound isolation David had aggressively engineered for me 6 years ago was now entirely his own. He was sitting alone at a massive conference table, completely stripped of his legal shield, his social standing, and his fabricated narrative. The mediator, Helen, maintained a strictly neutral expression, diligently documenting the sudden withdrawal of counsel into her official arbitration record. She quietly informed David that pursuing his custody petition under these new evidentiary circumstances would likely result in an immediate referral to the federal authorities. Panic finally breached David's carefully conditioned exterior. He leaned across the table, his hands trembling violently, and attempted to deploy his ultimate, deeply manipulative weapon. He looked directly into my eyes and invoked my dead mother's memory. He stammered that she would be utterly devastated to see her family destroying each other over financial misunderstandings. He desperately whispered that he was an old, grieving man who had simply made a series of desperate corporate miscalculations to preserve our family legacy. He begged for a quiet, internal resolution, promising to completely withdraw the custody petition if I simply destroyed Caleb's forensic audit. My heart maintained a slow, perfectly regulated rhythm. The terrified 18-year-old girl who would have instinctively surrendered to keep the peace had died in a freezing Dorchester apartment a long time ago. I leaned forward, ensuring my voice was low, cold, and entirely unyielding. I informed him that my mother would have been deeply ashamed of a man who stole his own daughter's social security number to subsidize a failing country club lifestyle. I stated clearly that there would be absolutely no quiet resolution, no sweeping his federal crimes under a luxurious rug. I told him that the comprehensive audit was already securely transmitted to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Banking Commission. His desperate attempt to steal Julian's $2.5 million trust fund had merely accelerated his own unavoidable incarceration. I watched the last remaining trace of arrogance drain completely from his face, leaving behind only the hollow, terrified reality of an exposed fraud. He opened his mouth to formulate another excuse, but no sound emerged. I stood up, adjusting the lapels of my steel gray suit. The verdict was final. A narcissist facing absolute annihilation will inevitably execute one final, profoundly chaotic maneuver. Just as Vivian and I gathered our documents to leave the arbitration center, David reached frantically into his suit jacket and produced a crumpled, notarized affidavit. It was a secondary emergency injunction, drafted independently of his fleeing attorney. He slammed it onto the table, his voice rising in a shrill, hysterical pitch. He claimed he possessed sworn eyewitness testimony proving I was actively physically neglecting Mia, demanding the mediator authorize an immediate unilateral freeze of the trust fund pending a Child Protective Services investigation. Vivian paused, her hand hovering over her briefcase. The mediator cautiously accepted the crumpled document. The sworn affidavit was signed by a man named Gregory, a notorious regular from the late-night diner where I had endured countless grueling shifts. Gregory was a man who habitually left $2 tips and smelled strongly of cheap alcohol. According to his beautifully typed, clearly purchased testimony, he had allegedly witnessed me leaving a crying, freezing infant locked inside a running vehicle in the diner's parking lot for several hours every single night while I worked my shift. David glared at me, his chest heaving with desperate, triumphant malice. He believed he had successfully detonated a bomb that would force me into immediate capitulation. He assumed that the mere threat of a Child Protective Services investigation would shatter my composure. I did not blink. I did not scramble to defend my honor against a fabricated character assassination. I simply looked at Vivian and nodded. Vivian opened her laptop and connected it to the conference room monitor. She did not engage in an emotional shouting match. She calmly displayed the certified, unalterable Google Timeline location data extracted directly from my mobile device, overlaid perfectly with the digital time cards from the diner's automated payroll system. The data unequivocally proved that during every single shift I worked over the past 5 years, my phone and my physical location never once intersected with Mia's location. Vivian then produced the notarized payment logs from Gloria, the retired neighbor who had meticulously documented every single hour she spent securely babysitting Mia inside her warm apartment. The geographical and financial data instantly, mathematically crushed the diner patron's purchased perjury. There was absolutely no timeline where the alleged neglect could have physically occurred. Vivian quietly informed David that suborning perjury to file a fraudulent injunction was yet another distinct felony to add to his rapidly expanding federal indictment. David stared at the illuminated monitor, his mouth slightly open, watching his final, desperate lie evaporate into digital smoke. He had absolutely nothing left. The structural collapse of David's meticulously curated life occurred with breathtaking, administrative speed. 30 days after the disastrous mediation session, a fleet of dark, unmarked federal vehicles arrived quietly at the Beacon Hill brownstone. Agents from the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation executed a comprehensive search warrant, systematically confiscating his servers, his physical ledgers, and the contents of his mahogany safe. The investigation into the $80,000 of identity theft had rapidly unraveled a much larger, deeply entrenched Ponzi scheme he had been operating within his local investment fund. The social consequences were immediate and absolutely brutal. The elite country club, terrified of federal association, publicly revoked his membership within 48 hours. The board of directors at his investment firm forced his immediate, disgraced resignation to violently distance the corporate entity from his toxic fallout. The bank holding the heavily leveraged mortgage on his brownstone initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. He left several frantic, sobbing voicemails on my secure mobile line, begging for a character reference, pleading for Julian to provide emergency bailout capital. I simply forwarded every single recording directly to Vivian and deleted the audio files. While David's empire violently disintegrated, my own life, quietly, beautifully expanded. I officially received my certified public accountant license in the mail. I did not frame it and hang it in a corporate high-rise to impress wealthy executives. Instead, Julian and I toured a modest, sunlit commercial space in a remarkably accessible neighborhood. I signed the commercial lease entirely in my own name, utilizing the savings I had meticulously accumulated. I opened a specialized, nonprofit financial advisory firm dedicated exclusively to helping single mothers untangle themselves from financial abuse. I sat at a clean, sturdy desk, surrounded by files that represented hope rather than terror. Women who had been trapped by weaponized credit scores and hidden debts sat across from me, and I used my own profound, agonizing experience to teach them how to safely navigate the exit. I showed them how to build invisible safety nets, how to read complex ledgers, and how to permanently sever the financial chains that kept them bound to their abusers. I was no longer the frightened teenager freezing on a concrete step. I was a structural engineer, actively designing robust escape routes for others. Every time I helped a mother successfully freeze her compromised credit or secure an independent bank account, I felt a distinct, powerful layer of my old trauma permanently dissolve. The ultimate retaliation against a man who weaponized poverty was to distribute the tools of wealth directly to his preferred targets. The foundation was unbreakable. Sunday dinners transformed into a sacred, heavily protected ritual inside my new home. The profound silence of the past 6 years was permanently replaced by the chaotic, beautiful noise of a family deliberately built by choice rather than biological obligation. On a particularly warm evening in late May, the dining room smelled richly of roasted garlic and fresh rosemary. I stood by the kitchen island, quietly observing the living room, allowing the overwhelming reality of my safety to fully wash over me. Julian was sitting entirely cross-legged on the thick living room rug. He was meticulously helping Mia assemble a highly complex, incredibly expensive vintage wooden train set he had imported directly from Switzerland. He did not mind that his tailored shirt was becoming wrinkled, or that Mia was aggressively demanding the train travel exclusively in unpredictable zigzags. He possessed the infinite, unbothered patience of a man who fully understood the irreplaceable value of ordinary Tuesday afternoons and chaotic Sunday evenings. Caleb sat at the dining table, looking healthier and vastly more relaxed than I had ever seen him. He had permanently vacated the Beacon Hill brownstone the very morning the federal agents arrived. He was currently wearing a crisp, well-fitted suit purchased entirely with his own legitimate salary. Vivian had officially hired him as a junior forensic auditor at her law firm, recognizing his surgical precision with spreadsheets. They were actively discussing a complex corporate tax loophole, arguing passionately over regulatory details while sharing a bottle of expensive red wine. I watched Caleb laugh, a loud, genuine sound that reverberated through the warm house. He was no longer the terrified, compromised courier sneaking winter coats in plastic bags. He was an independent professional, fiercely loyal to the sister who had shielded him, and completely liberated from the father who had terrorized him. This was the exact family dynamic my mother would have deeply cherished. It was completely messy, loudly opinionated, and fundamentally anchored in absolute, unconditional respect. We gathered around the large wooden table, passing plates of warm food, arguing playfully about European geography and auditing standards. No one monitored my posture. No one criticized my tone of voice. No one threatened to revoke my access to the meal if I expressed a dissenting opinion. I realized that the profound, aching void left by David's conditional, transactional love had been entirely filled. The family I had actively chosen was infinitely stronger than the family I had simply been assigned at birth. The table was full. Healing is rarely a cinematic, explosive revelation. It is usually a slow, quiet realization that the ever-present danger has completely vanished. Several months after the federal indictment completely dismantled David's life, I found myself standing in front of the open refrigerator, staring blankly at the perfectly organized shelves. It was stocked full of fresh vegetables, expensive dairy, and bright, unblemished fruit. I stood there for a long time, waiting for the familiar, agonizing panic of food scarcity to strike my nervous system. The panic never arrived. The terrifying mental calculus weighing the cost of a dozen eggs against the absolute necessity of a heating bill had permanently ceased operating in the background of my mind. I closed the refrigerator door and walked upstairs to Mia's bedroom. The air conditioning hummed a steady, clean rhythm. The room smelled faintly of lavender detergent and fresh cotton. There was absolutely no trace of the suffocating, metallic stench of black mold. Mia was sleeping deeply, her breathing perfectly clear, unobstructed by the damp, toxic air of our past. I sat on the edge of her soft bed and recognized a profound psychological shift. For 6 grueling years, my entire existence had been defined by a desperate, hyper-vigilant defense. I had built massive, impenetrable walls constructed from federal laws, offshore trusts, and aggressive restraining orders. I had trained my mind to anticipate betrayal from every possible angle, viewing every single interaction through the lens of potential exploitation. But sitting in that sunlit, peaceful room, I finally understood that the fortress had successfully performed its function. The heavy iron gates had securely locked the predators outside, which meant I no longer needed to walk the perimeter wearing heavy armor. I could finally lay the heavy shield down. I did not have to remain the cold, calculating survivor forever. I was allowed to simply be a mother, an accountant, a partner, and a profoundly safe human being. I walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet suburban street. The heavy, invisible chain of the Dorchester days had completely dissolved. I had faced the most terrifying phantom of my childhood in a glass conference room, and I had systematically reduced him to a harmless, irrelevant footnote in a federal court ledger. The boundary line between my traumatic past and my incredibly bright future was fully solidified. The air was clean. Society insists on romanticizing the concept of biological loyalty. We are consistently told that blood fundamentally binds us, that shared genetics demand infinite forgiveness, and that severing ties with a parent is an unnatural, unforgivable sin. I spent the first 18 years of my life desperately trying to balance an emotional ledger that was violently rigged against me. I believed the incredibly toxic lie that my profound suffering was an acceptable, necessary price to pay to maintain the illusion of a respectable family tree. I know now, with absolute, unshakable certainty, that those societal expectations are specifically designed to protect the abusers. Biology is simply a random accident of geography and genetics. It is not a binding moral contract. When the man who shared my DNA locked me out in a freezing blizzard, he permanently severed that biological contract. When he subsequently attempted to weaponize federal fraud to steal my daughter's financial future, he simply confirmed that he was a parasite, not a patriarch. Sometimes, the most profoundly courageous act a human being can execute is to deliberately take an axe to their own toxic family tree. You must forcefully chop away the rotting, diseased branches before the infection reaches the new, fragile blossoms. I built a beautiful, thriving forest entirely from scratch. I built it with Julian's quiet, steadfast respect, with Caleb's immense bravery, with Vivian's legal brilliance, and with the undeniable resilience of a 5-year-old girl who deserved clean air. David will spend his remaining years navigating federal courtrooms and IRS audits, entirely alone in a collapsing house he can no longer afford. He will never know the sound of Mia's laughter, and he will never benefit from the immense success I built with my own hands. I do not carry an ounce of regret. I look at the incredible, sturdy life I have constructed, and I understand the absolute truth about generational wealth and familial devotion. Legacy is not what you inherit. It is what you possess the fierce, unyielding strength to protect. If this story resonates with your own journey of cutting off toxic family members to protect your peace, please share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear it. Thank you for walking this path with me. The door clicked shut,